In this video, we're going over the concepts of chapter 3, which is titled Compounds, Putting Particles Together, Part 2. Throughout this video, we will be going over sections 3.4 through 3.7. In part 1, we learned how to name ionic compounds. We learned how to go from name to chemical formula and from chemical formula to name. In section 3.4, which is titled In Search of an Octet, we are going to go over now covalent bonding. From the first discussion about the different types of compounds, we learned that covalent bonding is made mostly by two or more nonmetals sharing electrons, and they're going to be sharing these electrons in order for them to obtain their octet. Because remember that many elements in the periodic table, once they form compounds, the goal is to have full valence shells. In addition to having two or more nonmetals sharing electrons to make a covalent bond, which is the only type of bond, I should say, for covalent, in other words, molecular compounds. In this course, if you see a metalloid combining with a nonmetal, then understand that that is also going to be a type of covalent compounds. As you can see here by definition, molecular compounds are formed when two or more nonmetals share valence electrons, and that's how a covalent bond is achieved in order to produce stability. So how do we name molecular compounds? Well, to name molecular compounds, we are going to be utilizing prefixes. And this is the first time that whenever we're naming compounds, we're going to utilize prefixes. Since in molecular, or in other words, covalent compounds, we're going to have two different nonmetals. As you can see, the first symbol for the first nonmetal that we see, we are going to utilize the name of the element. Now, that prefix that we see for that first element is only utilized when two or more atoms are present. That means that that first element must have a subscript, which is placed in the bottom right corner of the element symbol in order for that prefix to be placed. For the second nonmetal, you're going to utilize the base name of that second nonmetal element, and it's going to have an "ide" ending. A prefix is utilized also for that second nonmetal. Well, in the case of the prefix for the second component of our molecular or covalent compound, a prefix is always used. And just as a quick review, when it comes to the base name of that second element that is a nonmetal that ends in "ide," remember that this information is present at the table for nonmetal anion names. So make sure that you review and you go back into your notes for part 1 in order to remind yourself of those names. So I have mentioned that prefixes are utilized, but in order to introduce the prefixes, this table is actually part of a different reference book, but you can see that depending on that subscript, that is next to the element symbol on the bottom right corner, remember that these values that you see 1 through 10 are located at subscript. In other words, bottom right corner of element symbol. And as you can observe, if you have a subscript of 1, remember that a subscript of 1 is omitted. So be careful when you're looking at a chemical formula and you don't see a subscript. Remember that the subscript of 1 is there, but it's implied because subscripts of 1 are omitted. But if you have a second non-metal within your chemical formula and you only have one component or a subscript of 1, as you can see, the prefix that is utilized is mono. If you have a subscript of 2 in the first element or in the second one, you use the prefix of di. And as you can see, 3 is tri, 4 is tetra. From 5 to 10, they're all Greek prefixes. Penta, hexa, hepta, octa, nona, and deca. Now, it is important to note that if you have specifically oxide as that second, that second nonmetal, in other words, if you have a compound that the second nonmetal is oxygen, you have to kind of be careful when it comes to the subscript of 1 and then 4 through 10. So to give you an example of why we have to be careful with that, let me give you the following chemical formula. Here we have capital C, capital O. This is a covalent compound. So from the rules that we have, the first nonmetal that we observe is carbon. We don't see a number on the bottom right corner of carbon. And remember that for the first nonmetal, only it receives a prefix when it has a subscript of 2 or more. So right now, for it, we are just going to write the name of the element, carbon. Then for the second nonmetal, we are going to always write a prefix. As you can see, we only have 1 oxygen. There is a 1 there, but it is omitted. The prefix for 1 is mono. Next, because oxygen is that second nonmetal from the table that I mentioned, where we have the nonmetal anions, oxygen, we place the name oxide for that second nonmetal in this chemical formula. Now, as you can see, because our prefix ends in O and our second word is oxide, we must erase the O of the prefix, and then we should make one word. So the correct way to name this molecular compound is going to be carbon monoxide. This deletion of the ending O or A, in the case of tetra, penta, hexa, so on and so forth, understand that it's particularly important to remember when you have oxide as the second nonmetal. So when that occurs, if you have mono, tetra, penta, hexa, hepta, octa, nona, deca, and oxide is that second nonmetal, remember that the last letter from the prefix is deleted, and then you make one word with that oxide. Understand that this does not occur when your subscript is 2 or when the subscript is 3. It is important to note that there are some common names for a certain number of molecular compounds. And this information, I'm going to recommend that you memorize it for your second exam, because I will be mentioning the molecular compounds names and you need to know what are the chemical formulas and vice versa. Let's actually do some practice problems when it comes to, if we're given a chemical formula, how do we write the name? Or if we're given the name, how can we come up with the chemical formula? So when it comes to this, let's understand that I'm going to do on the left side the examples, specifically E and F. So remember that the rules for naming molecular compounds are the presence of a prefix, name of the element, and these rules are going to be for the first nonmetal. And remember that that also applies to a metalloid. And then for your second nonmetal, we're going to have prefix, stem of the name for that nonmetal, and the ending IDE. Let me repeat that this prefix is only for subscript of 2 or more. The prefix for the second nonmetal is always. So let's go over letter E. As you can see, we have 2 as the subscript for nitrogen. So when we are going to name that compound, we say di. Because of the subscript of 2, the name of that first nonmetal is nitrogen. When we observe the subscript next to oxygen, we see a 4. The prefix that it is utilized is going to be tetra. Because oxygen is our second nonmetal, oxide is the stem and the "ide" ending for an oxygen atom. Now, I mentioned about a special rule when your subscript that is added to oxide, or that oxygen has, I should say, is 1, in that case is called mono, or from 4 through 10. And in this case, you can see that we have 4. In this case, remember that the A in tetra goes away. And then the word oxide becomes one word with the prefix. So as you can see, the name of this compound is dinitrogen tetroxide. Let's do letter F. In letter F, we also have a nitrogen covalent compound. But here, since we don't see a number in the bottom right corner of that nitrogen, we know that we only have 1. Whenever we have a subscript of 1, particularly with the first element, we don't have to put a prefix. So the first word in this name is just going to be nitrogen. Then for the chlorine, we see a subscript of 3. Because that is our subscript, that means that we're going to put tri as the prefix. Chlorine, when it comes to the stem and the ending, is going to become chloride. And that's how we go from chemical formula to name. Now, what if we're giving a name? How do we come up with a chemical formula? Well, you will be reading if you have a prefix or not, and then you will be putting the symbol for the element that you're working with. So for this, I am going to do specifically letter D and letter E. So on letter D, I observe that I have disulfur. If I have disulfur, that means that I'm going to put the symbol for sulfur, which is a capital S. Di means that there are two sulfurs. The next word says heptoxide. So taking that into consideration, oxide refers to oxygen, and hept is the prefix for 7. So the chemical formula for this covalent compound is S2O7. In letter E, as you can see, I have arsenic. And when it comes to arsenic, the symbol is AS. We can observe that the second word says trichloride. Chloride refers to chlorine. And then tri means that I have 3 chlorines. And this is how you go for this particular example from the name of the compound to its chemical formula. Make sure that you practice the rest of the problems that you observe in the following slide.